Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be addressing so many members of the United States. I, of course, come from the disunited states of Europe, and that's really the starting point for most of our problems. I head an organization that's very similar in principle and activity to RAA. We have 65 airlines. Our average sector length is about 400 miles. Our average aircraft size is about 68 seats. But Europe, what is Europe? It's certainly far more complicated institutionally, excuse me, organizationally, culturally, than the United States. Europe, if we look at it, is, according to ICAO, 44 states. And that's how many states are in the membership of the European Civil Aviation Conference. As far as the European Union is concerned, it's 27 states. And they have their own set of legislation, regulations, driven by the European Commission, which is a set of unelected civil servants with absolute authority to originate regulations and legislation, and a European Parliament representing all kinds of political elements. As far as our air navigation services are concerned, Eurocontrol, which coordinates everything, it's 39 states, and the European Aviation Safety Agency, it's 31 states. We have multiple currencies, multiple cultures, and in each one of those states there is a national aviation authority. Just be glad that you have one FAA, one currency, one Congress. It makes life a lot simpler. Now, European transport generally is heavily, heavily weighted in favor of the train. Trains are owned by national governments, and national governments are very, very pleased to provide massive subsidies for those trains. Rail transport is the favored system. Annually, its subsidies amount to about 103 billion dollars. Now let's put that 103 billion into context for you. That's provided annually. We are working on a project called César, which is equivalent to your next gen. The estimated cost of César is 30 billion euro, which is about, what, $43 billion. So that's a major infrastructure project for us, but it's only half what we are subsidizing the rail system for annually. And as regionals, we're pretty scared that that César project is going to cost each one of our member airlines about $1.4 million per aircraft hull. We want to see some pretty significant efficiency improvements to justify that level of investment. Now, Europe's regulators work for governments, and Europe's governments are desperately short of cash. They might say one thing, that we're trying to protect the industry from future burdens, but the taxation burden in Europe is enormous. And air transport is just seen as a milch cow to be milked every time governments run out of money. As I said earlier, the European Commission has the right of initiative to introduce rules and regulations. You can't put toothpaste back in the tube. When we were wanting to have air transport liberalized, we needed some kind of regulatory initiative. But when they'd done that, we should have told them to go home. But in fact, they're still in their offices, and there's a certain amount of make-work activity. They've got some very, very talented guys who are committed, diligent, and honest. But the culture within the Commission needs radical change away from the "we know best, don't disturb us with the facts." In recent years, more than half of the costs of the average regional airline are outside the control of the airline CEO. That's occurred through aggressive cost recovery system principles, additional taxes and charges, and incredibly poorly thought out regulations. Many of you will probably heard the problems that we had with the volcanic ash eruption last year, what we had to pay in compensation and assistance to passengers on flights that were cancelled or delayed was unlimited. Unlimited hotel, meals, and accommodation, because the Commission refused to listen to the industry when that regulation was drafted, when we said this will not hold water in a period of massive system disruption. In the past 25 years, we've seen, as Roger showed this morning, the same kind of evolution in our average aircraft size. The smallest turboprops have virtually disappeared. And in recent years, we've seen the progressive increase in the number of turbofans slowed down to the point where it's more or less stabilized now at 55% of the fleet. Fuel prices have driven up the enthusiasm for the larger turboprops. Legislative decision-making process in Europe is intellectually corrupt. You've probably all heard of our emissions trading system, which comes in 2012. When that first proposal was drafted, the Commission did a form of an impact assessment. A year of subsequent amendments was considered by the Commission and the Parliament. None of those amendments were tested. And to give you an indication of the level of decision-making, on the final day within the Parliament, 1,100 plus amendments were considered by various politicians before the final legislation was decided. 1,100 amendments in one day? What kind of quality of decision-making does that indicate? It takes us more time than that to decide whether I go out this afternoon and buy a pair of cowboy boots. Europe has become a high-cost air transport area, and many of us are concerned that this is an absolute gift to the Middle East carriers who are quite prepared to overfly Europe, connecting the United States to Africa, Asia, and the Far East. And the European emissions trading scheme is not going to help that. It's going to collect an enormous amount of money. It could help fund César, but it's going straight into government pockets with no accountability of how that money is to be spent. I was very impressed yesterday by Secretary LaHood's speech. To see that level of support in the United States coming out for the air transport industry was very, very refreshing. There is not one Secretary of State in the whole of Europe who could make that kind of speech with that level of commitment without using the E word, environment, at least 15 or 20 times. We are driven, that's the first thing they say, a kind of a political genuflection to environment. We have environment driving air transport policy. In conclusion, for my opening comments, Secretary LaHood said, we don't have challenges, we only have opportunities. Well, in Europe, we are up to our necks in major opportunities. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was terrific. And while it is that there may be some differences, taxation, amendments, these kind of things do ring true in the United States as well, that's for sure.